Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. We are now 1 week on from the U.S. presidential election. While most expected a very close race, in the end, Donald Trump achieved a stunningly sweeping victory, doing better geographically and across almost every demographic. And so, for only the second time in American history, a president will serve a second non-consecutive term. In addition, the Republican Party has taken the majority in the Senate and appears on track to retain its majority in the House. Now, the process of putting together the new administration is underway, and the headline appointments, subject as ever to rumor and promotion, are quickly being filled. Here to discuss the election ramifications, administration formation, congressional relations, policy implication, and what it means for corporate leaders, I'm joined by two distinguished guests. Paul Ryan is here, familiar to many in this program's audience. He served as the 54th Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Notably, his tenure overlapped with the first 2 years of the first Trump administration. He was first elected to Congress, representing Wisconsin's 1st District, at the age of 28. And in 2012, he was Mitt Romney's running mate for the vice presidency. He's also a colleague today, serving as Vice Chairman of Teneo, along with a number of other roles in the private, academic, and public policy sectors. And Trey Gowdy is here. He served in the House of Representatives for South Carolina's 4th District from 2011 to 2019. He was the chair of the House Oversight Committee and served on the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. Today, among other endeavors, he is the host of Sunday Night in America with Trey Gowdy on Fox News Channel. And I'd like to welcome him to Insights for the first time. So, gentlemen, thank you both for joining. For our audience, Paul Ryan is going to be joining audio only, at least for the first part here. But maybe, Trey, since it's your first time on the show, we'll start with you. And just very quickly, since there's a lot of ground we'd like to cover, I'd love to just hear your very quick take on the events of the election, what it tells you, but also with all of this Monday morning quarterback going on, what it's not telling you.
Well, I've heard the phrase political comeback. It was more like a political resurrection. I mean, if you go back to January 7th, you go back prior to the 4 indictments and more counts than I can count, I don't think anyone saw this, and they certainly did not predict a popular vote victory. The Electoral College gets you the right to govern. The popular vote gives you closer to a mandate. And he won with demographic groups that Republicans have struggled with. And so the big takeaway is just how out of touch some folks in my line of work, quite frankly, the media and the coastal elites are with the rest of the country.
And Paul, how would you sum it up? Same question to you.
Yeah, exactly. I think the Democrats are going to have to go through a lot of soul searching. My guess is they probably don't, figure it out. And I think they ignited a culture war, which ended up becoming a bear trap that they set for themselves that they walked into and can't get out of. And they set themselves so apart from the mainstream Americans. In addition to that, 2 issues were spectacular failures: inflation in the economy and the border, which was just basically ungovernable. And that gave a perfect witch's brew where they had a real thumping. But I think where the progressives have a bigger problem is, not just tweaking a policy, say inflation and the border, but I think they stepped on the wrong side of a cultural war with the country that the country blew back on. And that, I think, explains a lot of the big demographic vote count that Donald Trump got. The middle class, forgotten men and women of America, that low-income voter is a Republican voter now. And you also combine that with a lot of traditional Republicans, including suburbanites, where Trump outperformed his 2020 numbers almost in every category. And that's a pretty comprehensive victory for him personally as a resurrection, like Trey said, but also a pretty thorough defeat for what the Democrats are offering the public these days.
And Paul, would you say it is fair to say, though, that the clock is now ticking? Because one other characteristic of elections in this giant election year around the world, 2024, was a wave of anti-incumbency. One could say we've had an anti-incumbent wave in the United States for most of the 21st century. So as we head toward already thinking about a midterm election, that is the clock ticking? The Republicans have got to make tangible improvements on those kitchen table issues that you've
Yes.
just been talking about, or what has typically occurred will reoccur.
Yeah, I think the mistake that could be made, I hope is not made, is that they take the Biden mistake, which is they think they got a giant mandate and they operate as if they did one, but with razor thin majorities in Congress that can't function on a mandate like that. Joe Biden acted like he was FDR and LBJ ×2, as if he had some massive mandate and he had razor thin majority in the Senate, in the House, and he couldn't deliver on those mandates. And so he scaled his agenda back, but more importantly, he overreached and he just got, his hand brushed back. That's where I think we could make the same mistake, which is we don't have big majorities. They're very small majorities. And so I think you had to bank wins on kitchen table issues like getting the border under control and getting the economy, getting economic growth back on track in a faster way. Get those blocking and tackling basic things done that are popular, that people expect us to do, and be careful about overreaching, because you're going to push these razor thin majorities too far and they probably will break. And so that's the lesson I think you should take from the Biden experience. But I'm not so sure that's where we're going to go.
So Trey, it seems like in the last few days, we've had a fast and furious set of names being put out there, both in terms of people who will be appointed to positions, people who have either taken themselves out or have been taken out of potentially moving into positions. I guess a couple of questions. If you have any thoughts on some of those names, particularly in kind of the big four: state, defense, justice, and homeland security, and sort of chief of staff and national security advisor and the like. But when you see these names being thrown out there that are going to require Senate confirmation, should we bank those names, or, considering that we've got quite a ways to go between today and the inauguration and the handover of power, that actually there could still be movement on some of these positions? Or when Marco Rubio is named as the guy who's going to go to state, we should bank on that being the guy who's going to be put in front of the Senate? And what can we glean about policy-wise, or big picture-wise, I guess, from these names so far?
I mean, a couple of things. 53-47 is a lot better than 51-49.
Sure.
There are Republican senators that cannot always be counted on to vote with the team. They usually do, but you can't assume it. 53-47 allows you to lose two Republican senators. I won't name them, but smart people know who I'm talking about, and still get who you want. Marco Rubio's first name is senator. He's going to be confirmed. Anyone in that body is going to be confirmed. I think that's a brilliant pick for Secretary of State. I'm sorry to see him leave the Senate. I actually talked to him this morning to congratulate him. I think it's a great pick. AG, I'll be watching that one. I care a lot about our Justice Department. I don't want to ruin my friendship with John Ratcliffe, but I think he'd be fantastic as AG, but I don't know that that's what he wants, but I think he'd be fantastic. I was disappointed to see Tom Cotton remove his name, and a little disappointed that Mike Pompeo will not be part of the administration. But you still have Brian Hook, and you still have Robert O'Brien, you still have Mike Walsh, you still have people that are, I think, really good on national security. Treasury, I think the leading candidate removed his name today. Homeland Security, that is a very difficult job. Kristi Noem and I came in together. I've followed her career since we parted ways and she became governor. That's a big, important job, and I wish her well. It's hard to win at that job, but border is tied for number one. So you got to deliver. To Paul's point, you have to put up wins on economic and border issues. That's where your mandate is. Your mandate may not be in other areas, but it's certainly there.
There's been some talk in the media that the names that have been put forward suggest a more hardline approach than when we were looking at the complete potential spectrum of people filling these positions. But I'm wondering if you agree that that's true, or it seems to me that former President Trump, President-elect Trump, still has quite a broad spectrum, at least on the national security and foreign policy front that I focus a lot of my time on, of people who are sort of traditional conservatives and Republicans all the way to a much more extreme or isolationist, or let's call them the prioritizers, the Elbridge Colbys of the world, and so on and so forth. And so actually, the president has a diversity of voices of advisors, or is it becoming more narrow, would you say?
No, I think some of his outside advisors are I don't want to say isolationists, but they're isolationists. I think some of his inside advisors are more strategic. He promised to end the war in Eastern Europe in 24 hours. I look forward to seeing that happen. I think it's going to end. I hope it ends without Ukraine ceding territory. Benjamin Netanyahu, you could argue, was one of the biggest winners last Tuesday night, and the country of Iran was one of the biggest losers. I think the Middle East is going to quiet down. I think our partners in the Middle East are going to be happy with this election result. I'll be interested. You know, he's got some people that are really tough on China that are popping up on the radar. So that's going to be interesting to watch. I would like the war in Eastern Europe to be resolved without Ukraine ceding territory. We'll see if he's able to pull that off.
You know, it's a truism of any administration that the org chart and the actual power structure don't exactly overlap, and I suspect that that's even more true in a Trump administration. If the first go around is anything to go by, how would you kind of characterize that as you see the org chart kind of starting to get filled in, but where's the real power? You know, in terms of when you think about how corporate America is going to be wanting to engage on any number of issues, is it going to be as straight line as who's sitting in the sort of key cabinet positions, or do you have to look more broadly and more nuanced than that?
I like to describe it as structured chaos. I think he enjoys hearing from a diversity of opinion. I have not been around him nearly as much as, say, Speaker Ryan would have been around him, but even the short times I've been around him, he will turn around and pick up the phone and call somebody out of the blue to just pick their brain on something. He is not afraid to ask what other people think. He has his core convictions. You can persuade him. I think the media narrative of Donald Trump is far worse than the reality that I've ever seen. There's not going to be retribution. He's not going to use the Department of Justice. I mean, look what he did in 2016. He said Hillary Clinton's been through enough. Everybody wanted to prosecute her. So, you know, people that make a living kind of monetizing fear and anger, they're going to continue to do that. But look at what he does, more so than what is said. In terms of who he listens to, it'll be a combination of people that he picks and people that aren't in public office at all. What I hope he avoids is picking people who then monetize and profit off of that relationship with him.
Yeah, right.
You can't hire people that go write negative books about you afterwards.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. You are of the view that this concern that a kind of retribution witch hunt is about to ensue is probably not likely at some wholesale level.
Well, first of all, you have to have a statute, you have to have the facts, you have to have a grand jury, and you have to have a prosecutor. So when you say go after, does that mean deny access? I think he's entirely, it would be entirely legitimate for him to do no more interviews with MSNBC if that's what he chose to do, for instance, or Bob Woodward, for Pete's sake. Why in the world are you talking to him in the first place? In terms of using the legal system to go after your enemies, I would say cite me an example of when he's done that.
So let me ask you, this is just a question I have out of pure curiosity, considering that both of you have sat in very powerful positions in in Congress. So Elise Stefanik is being sent put up for ambassador to the United Nations, and I'm just sort of curious, when you take somebody who has ascended in the House hierarchy very, very quickly and is in one of the most powerful positions, with a big potential career ahead of her. What's the attraction for somebody like that then to go to, say, the UN, which is already an institution that that the president-elect and many around him think is sort of a moribund and useless institution in the first place? What's the attraction for somebody to go and do that?
She's on the House Intel Committee right now. In fact, when Speaker Ryan put me on the Intel Committee, he said, Elise Stefanik will wind up being one of your favorite colleagues. And he was right.
Yeah.
She's always been about policy. I mean, her first job out of college was working on policy. She's not unlike Speaker Ryan, and the policy is much more interesting to her than the politics. She's smart. She's going to do well no matter where she goes. But her passion has always been foreign policy and national security. I think it's a good pick. She used to work for Paul, and I mean, Paul put her on the Intel Committee, which is, by the way, the most highly coveted committee in the entire House. The Speaker alone picks members of the Intel Committee. And he put her on there early on, and there really was not a more serious, sober-minded colleague on that committee. I mean, they all take that responsibility seriously, but it's a passion of hers. The fact that she decided to get into kind of House politics, conference chair, I think that was kind of an afterthought. Her passion is policy, much more so than politics.
I wanted to maybe shift for a moment here to Congress. My understanding is that President-elect Trump is going to be in Washington on Wednesday. He will be meeting with President Biden at the White House, but he's also going to be addressing the House Republicans. Maybe before we move to the House, we can start with the Senate, because we also have the Senate Majority Leader race tomorrow between Senator Rick Scott of Florida and the two Johns, Thune of South Dakota and Cornyn of Texas. It sounds like there's a lot of momentum behind Rick Scott. Any view on how the Senate Majority Leader race is going to go? And to Trey's earlier point about this kind of, 53 is better than having 51, clearly true. But so much has been made of this insistence on allowing for recess appointments. Is there a real concern that margin is not big enough?
Well, I don't want to touch the Senate race with a 10-foot pole. I don't want to put any of those guys in trouble. But I'll say it this way. They all know each other extremely well. They just had lunch today. They have lunch 3 days a week with each other. It is an inside baseball pick. They're interpersonal relationships. No outside pressure force is going to choose this secret ballot race. So, I don't know who the front runner is. I think most people think it's Thune. But that's something that's hard to speculate because it's such an inside baseball game. And I don't think outside forces are going to affect it. Trump hasn't endorsed anybody. It's not in his interest to do that. Why would you make the other guys and their factions upset with you by weighing in on this? Whoever they pick is going to be a good team player, get the majority moving. Recess appointments, that you just have to declare recess. I mean, and if you control the House and the Senate, that means you can have the vote to go into recess, and recess appointments can take place. So assume that that's going to happen. The question is, will there be some kind of a side agreement, kind of like side letters to deals with the administration, which is, well, on these appointments, we want to have them go through the Senate process, but maybe on these other ones, you could have a recess appointment. If you go into recess, the president can do whatever he wants in recess appointments, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's some kind of a side agreement between the Senate and the White House, the incoming White House on that.
And then moving to the House, should I assume that it will be Mike Johnson who he will not be challenged for that gavel?
Yeah, I don't think he's being challenged. I think he's got it. It's going to be a narrow majority, though. Anywhere from a 4 to 7 seat majority like we have now. The one thing you got to watch. I mean, Tim Walz, Elise. Okay, that's 2. T. Thompson would be a spectacular ag secretary, but that's 3. I mean, are we going to have a 4-vote majority or a 5-vote? I mean, you got to remember the governor of the state, and it could be a blue state governor, and like Elise's case it is, they pick the special election circumstances within their state's laws. Point being is it's months before you fill that vacancy. Right. And if you're doing reconciliation, which is a tight, tough vote to begin with, and then a tax bill, tight, tough vote to end with, and everything in between, you got to be really careful if you're playing with these margins. So I think they have to be a little cautious about. I mean, I think these are good. I'm glad Elise. I think this is in her interest. That was the point I was saying is Elise loves foreign policy. That's her first love on policy. She's a policy wonk. I think she's been thinking about this for some time. Walz is a very, very cerebral, smart, DOD defense, national security thinker. So he's picking good people from the House, but I worry if you pick any more, you're going to make Mike Johnson's very, very difficult job probably impossible.
And so where do you stand now in terms of what you think the risk is, or is there, this single member motion to vacate risk, this sort of Damocles that hangs over the House Speaker, and obviously we saw that play out in stunning fashion in the last Congress. But is that still a risk, or is there now so much coming together of the party in Congress that at least between now and the midterms it's not?
There are enough nihilists that probably could prevent it from happening. If Trump were to weigh in and say, let's make this thing work, he could help make a difference. I think getting rid of it's probably not going to happen, but maybe raising the threshold so that it takes some plurality, some good, decent number of members to do that. Maybe in the cards, but Trey, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I really enjoy it when I hear Republicans talk about something being anti-democratic. I can't think of anything less democratic than removing a duly elected speaker because one person got his feelings hurt by the ethics committee. I really would struggle to think of something less democratic than that. Raise the threshold to 5 to 10. I think the difference now is Trump will have no tolerance for these kind of games that they played, both when they first elected Kevin in January and then what they put him through in October. The 8, only 5 of whom remained. I just think Donald Trump is going to have no patience for these internecine fights that really, I mean, what changed? You got Mike Johnson instead of Kevin McCarthy, but what changed? Other than that, what changed?
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to
probably some threshold increase, or I would think is in the cards.
Okay. So I want to pivot in a moment here to policy expectations that you've got for, say, the early days, first 100 days and the like. But before we do, this Congress is not yet done. So what do you guys expect, if anything, to see between now and during this final lame duck period between now and the handover of power that's still likely to be achieved, if anything?
Approps, they'll probably do another CR. It'd be hard to imagine they're going to do an omnibus, in December. The question is, how long do they want to kick that CR into? There will be a school of thought that says, let's just get all the way to the fiscal year and clean our decks because it's going to be too hard. Problem is that really hurts the Pentagon. So you can make a case that domestic agencies can enjoy a CR, which is a Biden written CR, by the way, or a Biden government CR, which has its own faults from a Republican standpoint. But the longer the continuing resolution, the more restrictive it is on the Pentagon's ability to adapt to the battle space they have. And they have a huge adoption of new technologies that they need to embrace, and they want to, but they need the budget authority to do that, and they can't go with a year-old budget authority to do that. So that's going to be a big debate. So the question is, how long do they pump the CR into the next year? Is it January, February, September? There'll be a big debate about that. But remember, everything has to have Democrats' consent to this. 60 votes, everything that's going through in the lame duck will require 60 votes from the Democrat, that Democrats have to help provide. And clearly Trump is going to say, I want this out of my way, or this, I want this for when I'm there. So he's going to have a huge impact on that.
So moving to the policy agenda, and I guess you would probably agree that it would appear that a much more prepared and better organized administration is going to be there on day one than was there on day one in 2017. And it would seem that tariffs and immigration policies are sort of first and foremost up there, and then also starting to think about tax and dealing with TCJA. But maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about what your expectations are on each of those buckets: tariffs, immigration, and tax. And then I have kind of a follow-up question to bring it all together. But Paul, maybe start with you on those.
Well, okay, so you have to wait for your CBO baseline to be rewritten, which will be January. Then the budget committee start writing their budget. The deadline for that is April 1st. That typically gets slipped. It's conceivable you could write it a little earlier. That budget resolution sets your baseline for your reconciliation bill for the tax cut bill. You will have to premeditate what you're putting in that tax bill to make sure that baseline accommodates what you've chosen to do. What are you going to do on salt? All these campaign promises, in addition to extending the current code. How much deficit are we willing to absorb as a party, and can we pass? All those questions have to be litigated earlier. Then they pass that budget. Then they write that tax bill that conforms to that budget with its reconciliation protections. That probably takes you into the summer. So that's kind of that timeline. The tariff thing, once you have your cabinet in place and your sub-cabinet agencies in place, let's just say end of Q1, that's probably pretty generous, but let's just say that, they could probably start doing that, given that this is an issue with the administration, the incoming administration. Most administrations think they have unilateral authority to do that. The key question there in my mind is it going to be just an across the board thing, like the 10% across the board and the China thing? Or is he going to, like Trey mentioned earlier, listen to people, to companies that say, don't do it to us, give this exception for this legitimate reason. What's the process for those exceptions? What's the process for those waivers? Because that you could get mired down in a lot of quicksand really quickly with that. And it could be a pretty ugly process. So, frankly, I'm not a fan of any of this. I'm not a fan of the mercantilism of the tariff idea, but I'd almost rather just take the across the board than to have this Swiss cheese approach where it's everybody lobbying the administration. And that could become a pretty ugly looking, non-transparent process. So the question is, are they going to set up a legitimate, transparent process for that? Will Congress be involved in it or not? And we'll know that stuff probably by the end of Q2, I would say. But it'd be hard to see them going super fast on that, given that they have to put other people in place.
I mean, when you think about most of the mechanisms that would be used, first, potentially removing China from most favored nation status, and then using Section 301 and Section 232.
Those take time.
What's that?
Those take time.
Yeah. And does the president himself have authority on that? Or where's the line?
Well, we have a disagreement on that. I'm an Article 1 guy, but historically presidents do. Congress ceded that authority a good 100 years ago. And on 232, you could probably make a good case with China. I don't think you can make the case. And there are waivers that are expiring in March on 232 with the Europeans. 301, you have to go through a process on 301 before you can exact a 301 tariff. So again, those things take time. And it's I think it's safe to say some of this will get litigated, especially with Chevron deference being rolled back in this last Supreme Court. That gives the likes of the chamber and the Business Roundtable more fodder to say that this is not blanket authority to an administration to do across the board tariffs. They're supposed to be specific tariffs for specific reasons. 232, 301, national security, dumping, not just across the board. That's going to be litigated. Now, that will take a long time to litigate, but that's going to be a big debate.
And you started a few minutes ago talking a little bit about the tax front. Obviously, as in any campaign, there are a lot of promises made, and we've heard a lot of bits and pieces on everything from tax on tips to, and I'm thinking about asking management here to redesignate all bonuses as tips. I think that would be a great idea. Taxes on tips, tax on Social Security, foreign earned income, the corporate tax. How does the math work here, Paul?
I mean, those are very expensive. So the baseline right now, you can extend it out and say, let's just keep the current law permanent, or another 10 years is actually how you would do it. That's going to be a pretty good revenue hole based on CBO's current baseline, but you'll rewrite your budget resolution to accommodate that. I think the votes are there for Congress. Congress says we never intended these massive tax increases, so we're not gonna put that in the baseline. We're gonna bake that in. That's what I did when we wrote the TCJA in the first place. It's just these new campaign promises add a lot more fiscal space, which brings your deficit much, much, much higher. So salt, for example, a lot of conservatives like me, and I would suspect Trey, are in favor of repealing salt, want to keep it limited or repeal it altogether. That's not how New Yorkers and Californians think. So you've got to play coalition politics as well. And if you have let's just say a 5-6 seat majority in the House, you can't lose your New Yorkers or your Californians. So you're going to have to play ball with them, move that threshold around to make sure that they can be comfortable voting for it. Oh, and by the way, do that earlier in the process than you probably think you need to. That's the challenge you're going to run into. And that's going to show you, some pretty good deficits.
And how do you see the early stages on the immigration front playing out with regards to closure of border, regarding preparation for, say, mass deportations or ending birthright citizenship, travel bans, et cetera? Like, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit and where they are going to act earliest on that front?
Trey's the law and order guy. I'll give that one to him. He knows that stuff pretty well.
I would just say remain in order for folks that are fans of legislative power. Most of this is going to be done by executive action, although the House did pass an immigration/border bill early on. They've already passed it once, they'll probably pass it again. But if you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, he's going to have to do it with executive action. You know, I do hear the term mass deportation, but what I hear when I hear that is, okay, you committed a misdemeanor by crossing the border without permission. What have you done since you got here? If you have broken another law, the only sanctuary cities he's going to be interested in will be sanctuary cities for American citizens so they don't get killed. If you've broken another law, your days are numbered. If, on the other hand, you have children that have been born here, if you have been a law-abiding citizen, I don't see, when I hear mass deportation, I don't think of those folks, and I'm not sure he does either. I think he's looking at this from a public safety, national security standpoint, and so much has happened over the last 4 years. That's what he is thinking about when he says mass deportation. He's not talking about separating families that are already together here with kids born as Americans. Birthright citizenship is tricky. There's a Supreme Court case that you have to deal with. I do hear politicians talk about introducing a bill or an amendment to the Constitution. I mean, good luck. We've only amended the Constitution, a couple dozen times. Good luck, and I don't think you can do it with a statute.
Yeah, if you could do it with a statute, that's 60 votes in the Senate. And to Trey's point, there's a big debate is about whether that even works. Then it's 66 votes in the Senate, 2/3 in the House.
Right. So, on each of these policy areas that we've talked about, I want to get to a couple of others here in a moment. I think, a lot of the audience will probably take some comfort in the fact that perhaps the maximalist concerns that have been thrown around out there may not come to pass. But nonetheless, in all of these, there is an element that could be considered inflationary, right? And there are many, even in conservative financial circles, that will warn inflation has not, it's tamer, and it's moving in the trend is moving in the right direction, but it is not tamed. And and the risk of it flaring back up again, if we overheat this economy is very, very real. So where does considering what you were saying at the very outset, I think Trey said at the very, very outset about the role that inflation and its impact on the kitchen table actually had in this election, that fear of getting that reignited has got to be out there. And how do you square that with some of these policy, priorities?
Yeah, so I don't think supply side tax cuts that produce faster economic growth are inflationary. I think I come from the Chicago Bob Nundell School of Thought on that, which is there are good pro-growth things like deregulation, energy production, supply side tax cuts that give you faster economic growth. That can soak up inflation. But I think secular trends are out there that push up inflation in many other ways. I think interest rates are going down right now, but I think it's wrong to assume they're going to go back to where they were. I think the natural rate's going to be higher. And I think just secular trends out there are pushing rates up, pushing inflation up. De-risking and decoupling with China is inflationary. If we do across-the-board tariff increases and then there's retaliation, that becomes inflationary. So I think there are a lot of secular things out there in the economy that are putting upward pressure on rates, that are making it harder to bring inflation down. I think in the short term, rates are coming down because the Fed has put their path. Their numbers suggest that they're going to hit their target. But I think long term, medium term, I think we have upward pressure on prices, and I don't think we've slayed the inflation dragon for good. I think there are things we could do to help drive that. Labor, and you got to get your labor policy right. If we truly do constrict labor even more, then that's inflationary. If you spend too much money like the Biden crowd did, that's inflationary. So there's some real trouble spots out there, and I think the administration would be keen to worry about, is this policy going to be inflationary or not, and rethink if it is. And I think there are a lot of good economists that can give them some guidance on that.
And just to be clear, because you and I have talked about this before on this program, do you fear or feel that there will be any pressure to decrease the independence of the Fed?
I'm not worried about that. Again, 60 votes. You have to rewrite the Humphrey-Hawkins law, which guides the Fed. That's 60 votes. That's not going to happen. Will Donald Trump jawbone the Fed? Of course he will. He did that to Jay Powell all the time before. Jay's used to that. It's kind of a shoulder shrugger. So no, I'm not worried about the independence of the Fed being corrupted, because truly to do that, that requires independence. They don't get their money from Congress. Congress can't go after them through the appropriations process. We should be able to go after the CFPB, and even that was upheld in this Supreme Court because they get their money at the Fed, like the Fed gets its money from the Fed. So there really isn't a way to go after them through the power of the purse or in any way other than rewriting the law that governs them, and that cannot be used through reconciliation. That takes 60 votes. That ain't going to happen.
Although Paul does raise a fascinating point, Kevin, which is there will be tremendous pressure from the outside to do away with the filibuster rule. The folks whose first name is not senator will weigh in on that.
Yeah.
So what I would encourage my Republican friends to do is go cite all the things that would have become law under Obama or Biden, but for that 60 vote threshold. So be careful what you ask for in the short term, because it may come back to bite you in the long term, like it did with judges. Republicans changed the blue slip procedure, and as a result, they lost influence on district court judges under Biden.
All we got to do is lose another election, and you got Puerto Rico, you've got DC, you've got 15 Supreme Court justices, and you can just, the parade of horribles you can string out in front of you. There are too many institutionalists in the Senate. That's not going to happen. John Curtis, Mitch McConnell, Bill Cassidy, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. I can go on down the list. They're not going to get rid of the filibuster. They'll be pressured. Probably. I think Trey's right, but they're not going to get rid of the filibuster because they're institutionalists. They understand the long-term, future of the Senate is to not be another majoritarian legislature, but to it takes a lot of consensus in this country to do big things because of the filibuster.
So there are a number of other policy areas that we haven't been able to address today. I wanted to get more into foreign policy and national security, climate change and the environment, and the IRA, what you're looking at in terms of the M&A space out there as regulations come down, and of course healthcare. But in the interest of time, and I know we'll have you guys back on in the future, there'll be plenty of time to parse all of this stuff. But of course, guys, here at Teneo, we are fielding a lot of calls from a lot of companies about how to position themselves and how to interact with this administration. I think a lot of them were probably thought they were never going to have to deal with these guys again. And now all of a sudden, it's back. And there's this kind of question about whether on a couple of things were the sort of the modalities that they put in place to interact with this administration in 1.0 going to still be relevant in 2.0, and that's the best approach? Or, as you're talking to, corporate leaders, how are you advising them as far as interacting with not just the White House of the next administration, but the incoming Congress as well?
Well, I'm going to quote the gentleman from Wisconsin when I first got to Congress. He said, it's better to be a good guy with a bad idea than a bad guy with a good idea. Relationships matter, not just with your own senators and member of Congress, but you have to look at, like, who are the cardinals? Who are the subcommittee approach chairs? Who are the subcommittee chairs on committees that you care about? I mean, I was on Intel and Oversight and Judiciary. I didn't get a ton of phone calls. Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, Senate Finance. I mean, do you have a relationship? The President Trump that I have been around, I have not been around him that many times, but clearly he forgives people. I mean, there are people in his orbit now that have said things like not complimentary things about him. So he is capable of letting things go. But do you have a way in? Do you have a way in to at least? Here's the question: why? Pick tariffs, for instance. Why do you do what you do overseas? Is it because you can't do it here because the regulatory structure won't allow it, the litigation structure won't allow it, or is it just a slightly better margin? If you can't answer the why, then you're probably not likely to get like the response you get. But if you have a legitimate why, I think you'll be surprised.
Yeah, I'd say if it's on Trump's radar, then he wants to get involved in these issues. He likes to be in the mix of it. If it's not on his radar, he's just going to leave whatever executive agency off to go do their thing. And Congress has a huge impact on all of those things. To Trey's point, I'd say it's going to be a good M&A climate because you're not getting no more Lena Khans and Gary Genslers. It's going to be light touch regulatory footprints. That's why I think private M&A and public IPO is going to be very, very fluid. It's going to be, I think the IPO market's going to unlock. I think private deals are going to get done. I think you're going to see capital flowing far more liquid, deeper capital markets moving because this administration will take a light regulatory footprint on these things. You look at the crypto industry, those guys, the Bitcoin's at like 88 grand now, I think. So I think that's probably what's going to happen. But if you're in an area, let's just say you're a solar panel manufacturer, or you're in an area that is uniquely bringing in a lot of inputs from foreign overseas, and you're worried about tariffs, that's an area where you've got to really mind your knitting. You got to focus on this, and you have to go communicate with this administration, with allies and friends in Congress, and with the relevant decision makers in the administration. That's just the way it works. That's probably how it was with 1.0. I mean, I was in Congress then, so I didn't think about how businesses approach, but I got to say, when I was in Congress then, it was all hands on deck, everybody and their brother coming to government saying, what's happening? Where is this going? I think it's going to look similar to what it looked like the last time.
So, just to close this out, I guess I want to ask you one final question, both of you, because as I've spoken to executives and boards just in the last week alone, I think that, much of the discussion has been focused on policy, just as you guys have been discussing here today. And I think that I think a lot of them have taken some comfort in the level of preparation that they have done for and thinking through how the probable policy matrix is going to play out for them. And I think they're doing a good job. Where I'm hearing more worry, and it's just sort of one of those things that's in the back of their mind, is how much of the return of the crazy there is going to be, number one, that they are likely to have to react to. And what's changed in terms of what the reaction function environment is going to look like. I guess my question in a sense is, have the thresholds that required a corporate response changed as a result of this election?
It's a good question. If I were running a company, I'd just stick to my knitting and sell your widget, make your thing, and leave the rest alone. Because if you weigh in on one thing, then you're going to have to weigh in on everything. And not weighing in on the other things because you weighed in on one thing is weighing in on something. The point being, you will get yourself upside down pretty fast and off track, off core mission. Stick to core mission. Every now and then there's a big issue that can arise that requires some kind of a statement. But generally speaking, I think if you start, feeling like you have to comment like you're a politician, you're not being a CEO.
And to be fair, you have been making essentially that recommendation through various administrations, not solely this one, right?
Yeah, because right now, I mean, look what happened to the left. They just got pushed back by pushing this woke ideology onto society, a society that just voted against having that. So I don't think you want to be reinforcing that kind of push if you're in the C-suite.
And do you think, I think you've pushed this point as well, Paul, in the past, and is it even more true given the personality of President Trump, that it's actually important that the CEO themselves be engaged in Washington to express their needs, their preferences, and to Trey's point, their rationale for what they need, as opposed to leaving it to surrogates and
I'm a limited government conservative. I wish they never had to come to Washington in the first place. So I personally don't like the idea of that, but I do think that is wise advice, which is out of sight, out of mind. If you're not in place, giving your perspective, so someone will assume something else. I don't know, Trey, what do you think?
Yeah, I would just caution people not to believe the slate magazine caricature of President Trump. I'm rarely around him, and it's usually about golf. But you know, Kevin, the last thing he said to me is, "Gowdy, you're wrong half the time." Most people would take that as an insult. I actually thought, you know what, it's pretty good that you're willing to play golf with somebody that you think is wrong half the time. I think the public caricature, and even what he says, is very different from what he does. So if you can get in front of him, if you can make your case, if you can separate the rhetoric from the action. Again, I point to all this talk about retribution and revenge, which I'm not a fan of as a Department of Justice guy. I don't think it should be used as a weapon against your friends or foes. But name me somebody he went after with the criminal justice system for all the threats. Give me a name. I mean, he was even floating the idea of paying off Kamala Harris's campaign debt. I've never heard anybody suggest that before except him. So just separate out what the left is, talking heads left who monetize that. Separate that out from the reality.
It's too much work to do. They don't have time, and they don't have the political capital for that anyway. They've got too much to do to try and fix things.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much. All of this talk will turn to action soon enough. And so I'm sure we will revisit a lot of these issues. And, you know, for our audience's sake, I just want to say that our plan on Teneo Insights going forward and into the early part of next year is we're going to start doing episodes focused on particular issue sets and bring experts and in-house expertise to the table to talk about those in greater detail. But this has been a phenomenal overview and preview of what is to come. And to Trey's point, if news reports are to be believed, the president of South Korea has picked up a golf club for the first time in 2016 because he's getting ready. So with that, I will leave it. I know, Paul, you've got to head out. So I want to thank you both for your time. Thank our audience for joining us today. There's a lot of moving parts here. We will continue to follow this story very closely. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Teneo Insights at teneo.com. We will get our Washington office involved. Until then, I want to thank Trey Gowdy and Paul Ryan for joining me. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.